sponsored by the James Madison Council and the National Endowment for the Arts.
Hello, I'm David Rubenstein, and I have the privilege today of interviewing two people who have written a really interesting novel. The people are Elliot Ackerman and Jim Stavridis. Let me introduce them in a moment, but I would say their book, 2034, is an excellent description of what could possibly happen down the road between the United States and China and some other countries that are talked about in the book. If you've seen me do interviews before, you know I tend to focus on nonfiction. I'm not a gigantic fiction reader, but I read this book and enjoyed it so much that I decided I'd made a mistake and I got to read more fiction because it's such an interesting read, and I highly recommend it to everybody. It's a New York Times bestseller, and it certainly deserves to be. Let me introduce Elliot Ackerman first. Elliot is a journalist and a novelist. He is a graduate of Tufts University, summa cum laude. He then served 7 years in the Marines, where he served in the Middle East and in Southeast Asia, I guess I would say. It's in Afghanistan, and was awarded the Silver Star and the Purple Heart, among other commendations. He now is written a number of books and writes for a number of publications, including The Atlantic. And he has a person who lives in Washington, D.C., and is somebody I've come to know. I've known his father for a long time, and I'm really pleased that Elliot combined with Admiral Stavridis. Admiral Stavridis is a graduate of the Naval Academy. He rose up to be a 4-star admiral. He also managed to get a master's and a PhD from the Tufts Fletcher School of Diplomacy, which he later served as a dean. After he left his Navy position, he served as the head of the Southern Command, the first Navy admiral to do so, but also served as the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. He's deeply involved in writing. This is his 10th book. He's also deeply involved in philanthropic matters. He's the chair of the board of the Rockefeller Foundation, but most importantly, he's the vice chair for global affairs at the Carlyle Group, a firm that I've been associated with from its beginning. So thank you both for taking the time to do this, and I'm looking forward to hearing all about the book. But first, let me ask either or both of you, how did you decide to come together and write a book together? And was it hard to write the book, and who wrote what, and how did you figure out, how to make this work?
Let me try the first part of that, which is I put together an idea looking at Cold War literature, David, which you and I are both old enough to remember. Red Storm Rising, Third World War, Bedford Incident, Failsafe, On the Beach. And I thought, there's no comparative body of literature for, unfortunately, the Cold War that I think we are walking into with China. So I pitched that to my editor, and he tossed the idea over to Elliot for the two of us to write it together. Elliot?
Sure. And I would only add that I think our editor didn't realize that the two of us had known one another for the better part of 10 years, because when Jim was the dean at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, he had me there as a writer in residence for a semester. And one of my duties, when I asked him, what does it entail to be the writer in residence, was to talk with the dean about books when he feels like it. So we sort of already had a shared sensibility speaking about books. And then I think one of the things we had with regards to this book was a shared vision of what it would be, which would be a cautionary tale, and one that was very much character driven. And in 2034, you really enter this world through the eyes of 5 diverse characters.
So Jimmy Carter famously tried to write a book with his wife, and he said that's the closest they ever came to getting divorced. So was it easy to write a book with somebody else when you're not used to writing a book with somebody else, or do you all still talk to each other and you're happy with each other still?
Well, the best way I can categorize that, David, is we have signed a contract to write not one, but 2 sequels, 2054 and 2074, to follow the storylines deep into the 21st century. So I'll let Elliot answer, but for me, it was a joy to work with someone I consider a real novelist who's published 6 novels and is a National Book Award finalist. So I consider myself the lucky part of the couple in writing the book.
Sure, and I would only add that the fact that we really had a shared vision of what this book would be made it a joy to write. So, I like to tell people for a book that's about a pretty grim subject, which is a global war with China, we certainly had a lot of fun writing it.
Okay, so the basic premise of the book is that the United States and China go to war, and nuclear bombs are set off in the United States and in China. And some cases, you could say with a lot of forethought. In some cases, maybe there was an effort to maybe not have them go off, but they couldn't be prevented. So you have a number of cities where nuclear bombs went off. Was it hard to pick which cities you wanted to designate as potential nuclear targets and where nuclear bombs went off?
I think it was a joint decision, and we tried to spread the wealth, so to speak. Two big cities in the United States, I don't want to reveal them, two big cities in China, including one extremely important one. And I think, David, unfortunately, that's kind of the reality of a war, is that you're not picking what city ends up under a mushroom cloud, your opponent is. And so I would say in the novel, we were fairly accurate about the cities China would pick and the cities the United States would pick. Hey, the good news, the book is not apocalyptic. The world does not end. It's a cautionary tale, as Elliot said. Both nations walk up to the edge of that apocalyptic strategic nuclear moment. Both step back, but still an enormous amount of destruction and loss.
Well, the theory behind nuclear weaponry has been, ever since the first two bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, is that if somebody else who you drop a nuclear bomb on, they have a nuclear bomb, they're going to drop one on you, called mutual assured destruction, in effect. And that happened here. The United States, under your novel, had a nuclear bomb launched on China. China retaliated, and then we retaliated again. So do you think the doctrine of mutual assured destruction is really what has kept nuclear bombs from being launched since Nagasaki and Hiroshima?
I think it has. And the key here is that these are, in the novel, tactical nuclear weapons. No one goes to strategic, as in destroy the other society entirely. But the cautionary tale that Elliot mentioned is simple. It's that it is very difficult to control that ladder of escalation that in this novel starts in the South China Sea. Some ships get sunk. Pretty soon, nuclear weapons are going back and forth. Very hard to walk away from that. That's the cautionary tale.
Okay. The novel really focuses on, I would say, two issues that are disputes between the United States and China. One is Taiwan, and one is the South China Sea, which are the issues that we have right now. You believe those issues will be with us at least through 2034 and not be resolved before 2034? Do you think those kind of issues can be resolved before 2034 in the real world, not the novel world?
Well, I think since the book has come out, one of the bits of criticism that we've received, which I think has been well taken, is, love the book, think the scenario is plausible and follows its own logic, but you got the date wrong. And that the date is actually closer to us than 2034. So I don't want to speak for Jim. I certainly think that these issues are very much in play.
For those who are not nuclear weapon experts, what's the difference between a strategic nuclear weapon and a tactical nuclear weapon, especially if you're, the target of one of those?
Yeah, there's no difference in terms of the actual weapon landing on your city. The difference is a strategic nuclear strike is one that goes after the capital, the chief financial center, all the military targets, all the major sociological centers of your society. Think, in the case of the United States, any city with a population larger than 1 million people, or in the case of China. A tactical nuclear strike is one that uses a smaller weapon that goes after a more discrete target, perhaps a shipyard, perhaps a single city, perhaps one oil refinery. So it's a difference in scale, not so much in targeting.
One issue which has arisen recently, and you might comment on it, it's not really in your novel, but is how does the President of the United States actually decide to launch a nuclear weapon? Does he can do it by himself? And if he says yes, how does somebody tell them, hey, that's a mistake? And do you have all kinds of codes? And can somebody lose the codes? And are you sure that the system actually works?
I'm sure the system works. We will not lose the codes. Unfortunately, in my view, the president of the United States can wake up on a Tuesday morning and launch a nuclear weapon. That's the reality of the system. It's baked in because of our concern that if Russia, in particular, launched a massive strike, we would want to retaliate massively before Russian missiles could take out our strategic nuclear system. I think that as we are coming off of recent events, there's a legitimate reevaluation of whether we ought to let the president do that or not. I'll close by saying a lot of controversy about General Mark Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs. His role is not to say yes or no on a strike, but his role is very much to be involved in the conference call where such decisions are made to provide his military advice. I think by all reports, what he has purported to do to ensure that he was part of advising the president makes sense to me. But I think the larger question, David, is whether we really want a single person to have complete control of our nuclear arsenal. That's the situation we are in today.
So in your book, you have made India a very big power. India has enormous amounts of power to, in effect, control our own communications at some point. Is it your personal view, both of you, that India will be the next great military power as well as the great next economic power?
I think that India fulfills a very interesting role in the book in so much as, listen, if we look at the last 100 years, the last 100 years have very much been an American century. And if they were an American century, it was one that was birthed out of two European conflagrations, right? The First and the Second World War. And those were two wars that the United States didn't start, but we certainly finished. And in recent years, the United States has gotten very adept at starting wars, but not finishing them. So the question sort of becomes, in a story that's premised on the United States and China starting a war, is who finishes that war? And oftentimes the nations who are the true beneficiaries of wars might not be the ones who start it. So I hope I'm not giving too much away there, but I think India does play a very big role in the end game of this war. And it doesn't necessarily have to be India, but it's posing a question of, just because you and another nation start a war doesn't mean that one or the other will be the beneficiary.
So I've often
let me add one
when
point, David, which is quite simple. Do we think India by 2034 will have the capabilities we posit in the novel? I think realistically the answer is no. But by 2054, by 2074, by 2094, at the end of the day, 300 years from now, when the history of this century is written, a historian will look back. It will not be about the rise of China. It will be more significantly about the rise of India. That's across the spectrum of this century. By 2034, perhaps not, but the characteristics we attribute in the novel are markers for where we both think India could head as the century unfolds.
So let me ask you, when you write a novel, do you know on day one how it's going to end, or do you kind of figure out you'll figure it out as you go along?
No, I think you certainly figure out as you go along. I think when a book begins, you might generally know what it's about. But I would say certainly for this book, neither of us knew exactly how it was going to end. But I think one of the joys of writing a novel, and as you become more and more deeply engaged and become more and more intimate with the characters and the story, it starts to reveal itself to you. And so that joy is when sort of the end is finally revealed to you. And in our case, we're able to put it on the page.
Now, you have identified the President of the United States as being a woman. You never say what her name is. You never give any character description of her. And she doesn't seem to be that deeply involved in the day-to-day decisions about launching nuclear weapons. Why did you not identify her? And why did you, in fact, you didn't identify the leaders of China or Russia or India either. Why did you do it that way?
Well, I think there's sort of two answers to that. I would say the first one is sort of a stylistic one, which is whenever, as you know, David, whenever the principal walks into the room, it sort of sucks all the oxygen out of the room and people start behaving differently. So we wanted to very much tell this story at the level of the operators, the people who are behind the scenes and very often making things happen. And I think also, in these times, kind of leaving that person a little bit off stage gives more room for the characters to have a fuller life. But as you alluded, yes, the President of the United States is a woman in 2034, which I think is unremarkable. I don't want to speak for Jim, but I think both of us would be shocked if we hadn't had a female president by then. But I think what is maybe more remarkable is that she's neither a Republican nor a Democrat. By this point, our political parties have become so dysfunctional that she is elected as the first independent president since, she served since George Washington.
Okay.
Yeah, and I would just add, David, and David, you're the historian in the crowd. You have a wonderful new book coming out about history. And, we didn't start as Republicans or Democrats. And you know what? Newsflash, it's not in the Constitution, Article XX. There shall be two political parties. One shall be Republican, one shall be Democrat. We've had Whigs, we've had Federalists, we've had Nationalists, we've had Progressives, the original name of Teddy Roosevelt's Bull Moose Party. We've had a lot of political parties. My guess is we are ripe for a new political party over the coming decades.
Now, you didn't also describe in the book what people often describe when nuclear weapons go off. They describe the horrible deaths and so forth by radiation and explosion and so forth. You didn't go into that. I assume there's a reason you didn't want to go into that, but what was the reason?
I'll start on that by simply saying any novel, you want to kind of create a frame. And our frame was this collection of individual characters. None of them were involved in that destruction. None of them were in that city. They had some connections to it, of course, like anybody would. But the idea of the book, from my perspective, was to track these characters who were stalking horses for their nations and tell the story through their eyes. I always say, David, big doors swing on small hinges. These characters are small hinges, but they hopefully tell the story adequately.
Do you think, Admiral or Elliot, that cyber warfare will also be very important in 2034 and beyond that? You do describe the ability of some countries in this book to, in effect, wipe out the communications of the United States for a period of time. How realistic is that to happen?
Utterly realistic. And the new strategic triad of warfare is unmanned vehicles, to include from space all the way to the bottom of the ocean, unmanned. Number two, cyber and cybersecurity. Number three, special forces, elite, performance-enhanced human beings. Those three things together and the synergies are where war is going. And we try to lay that out in the novel.
Now, Admiral, you're a Navy man, and Elliot, you're a Marines, which is part of the Navy, I guess you would say. Why is it all the senior people here are admirals in your book? Why don't you have any generals that, can't generals do anything good? You only have admirals with authority in this book.
David, I would just beg to differ on one point, which is we do have one retired Army officer in the book. He plays the National Security Advisor, and he is one of the arch villains in the novel. But I'll allow Jim to expound further.
All right. So
I also want to point out he's also a West Point graduate. So I think that pretty well answers the question, David. We need more admirals, fewer generals. We'd get along better.
So as you go forward, are you going to have? Is this book going to become a movie 2034, or you can't say?
There's been a number of folks who are, who are interested in it, and we're working with one team right now. We hope that it would come to the screen. We think it's a good yarn, and we think that there has been in the past a rich history of when I say literature, I'm going to also include film in that. I remember watching when I was much younger, films like Dr. Strangelove or Red Dawn or War Games. And I think that the Cold War was so richly imagined that one of the things that prevented us from ever fighting that war was that, we and the Soviets could agree on few things, but the one thing that we could agree upon based on our imagining that conflict was that it was one to avoid. And so as Henry Kissinger recently said, enter the foothills of a Cold War with China, I think it's important to imagine these events so that we can avoid them both in books and, hopefully maybe later on the screen.
So what would you say is the main message of this book? If you were to encapsulate it in a paragraph for somebody who wants to maybe read the book, but is trying to figure out, should I read the book? Should I buy the book? What's the main message you're trying to convey?
The message I tried to convey, and I'd love Elliot's answer because I think they kind of fit together. Mine is, if you don't pay attention to the way in which nations are walking toward conflict, your chances of entering that war are much higher. And what I mean by that, David, is it's not a book that echoes, in the end, the Cold War with the Soviet Union. It's a book that echoes World War I. 1914, and the way in which all of these nations of Europe, completely intertwined economies like ours and China's are today, managed to stumble into a war that destroyed Europe, that ended the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, the Kaiser's Germany. So the simple message is pay attention. And I hope that individuals will read the book and think about how we avoid sleepwalking into a war. Elliot?
Hey.
Certainly. And I would only add, and this is actually something Jim once said that resonated with me about the book, which is, if you do pick up the book and we invite you to come into this world of 2034, I think we both hope that as you shut the last page, look out your window, look at your kids or your grandkids, or walk down the street, see your neighbors, see a friend, and smell the air and realize this world is pretty good, and we should try to avoid conflicts like this at all costs, because what we have is certainly worth preserving.
Okay. All right. Here's a question from Anna. Did you both have an interest in historical fiction before writing 2034? What books influenced or inspired you?
I'll go first. Yes, enormously. I love historical fiction. One that's always on my mind is Gates of Fire by Stephen Pressfield, about the Battle of Thermopylae, the Spartans. I'm Greek American, so I'm required to get a Greek reference into every presentation. Historical fiction opens your mind to both disasters and successes of the past. Another one that comes immediately to mind is Winds of War by Herman Wouk. We didn't want to write a big, huge doorstopper with, 100 major characters, but that idea of illuminating the past, and then in this case, thinking ahead into the future, made a lot of sense. Elliot?
Yes, certainly. I'm always been a lover of historical fiction. I try to read wisely. I would say Shahara's The Killer Angels, which is about the Battle of Gettysburg, which is sort of a contained book with a relatively lean cast of characters and a pretty vast battlefield, is a book that I've always loved. Shakespeare's Henry V is a book that I love, which is about or a play that I love, which is about the Battle of Agincourt. That was the book I was thinking about while we wrote this, and it's really because it goes forward. It's also a little bit of a work of science fiction. So books like Ender's Game, for instance, is a classic that I've returned to many times.
And can I add one, which is the book Dune by Frank Herbert, about essentially an Arab-like world in the future and a battle for liberty and freedom. Literature, fiction, and David, I'm so happy you're now pledged to read 20 novels a year. That's what I heard you say.
I'm certainly going to read all of yours, but here's something from Bob. It says, our 560 ship Navy is gone. We're under 240 ships, staffing shortages of technical sailors, low morale. Is any of this covered in your book when you discuss the Navy?
It is covered in the sense that as the novel opens, the Navy is overmatched by China. And that is realistic looking at the trend lines we're dealing with today. Today's Navy is actually around 270 ships. China's Navy comparative is about 350. China is overtaking us. If we don't step up and build the Navy and our Marine Corps to operate alongside us, we will be greatly disadvantaged. So we need to be very mindful of this, not because we want to attack China, not because we want to invade China, not because we want a land war in Asia, but because we want to deter China. I think the genesis of the question is correct.
I have a question I'd like to ask you as well, which is, can you explain, Admiral, the dispute that's going on now between Australia, United States, and France? What's the difference between the kind of submarines that are now going to be built and what kind were going to be built by the French? And what's the difference between those submarines?
The difference between a diesel submarine, which is what France was going to build for Australia, and a nuclear powered submarine is enormous. A diesel submarine, David, think of it like a hybrid car. It's got a battery that operates a lot of the time, but then it has an engine that kicks in when it needs to go faster. Over here, that nuclear powered submarine is silent. It doesn't need fuel ever. It can go endless distances. It never has to surface. It is vastly superior to that diesel submarine. So the Australians, in my view, correctly said three things. Number one, we want that technology because the Pacific is vast. Number two, we want to be more aligned with the United States, which is a Pacific power in the way that France has not been a Pacific power since the 1600s. And thirdly, the Australians said, we want to be part of facing China. And to do that, we're going to need a nuclear powered submarine. Bottom line, smart move by the Australians. It has chaffed the French, understandably. I think the US French and, in fact, the Australian French relationships are bigger than this. There's going to be a period of time where it'll be very difficult. I think it was the right move for Australia.
So, Elliot, you graduated from Tufts, as I mentioned, summa cum laude, and you have a very distinguished set of parents. I know both your parents quite well. What was their reaction when you said, I'm going to join the Marines, I'm going to go into combat, and, you know, I'm going to be basically risking my life? What was their reaction?
Well, it's interesting you should ask that. You know, I actually joined the Marine Corps in 1998, so it was before 9/11. And as we sort of approach as we pass through this 20th anniversary of 9/11, it's remarkable to think how much the world has changed since I first went into the Marine Corps. Because the Marine Corps I entered was, in fact, a peacetime Marine Corps. I was a ROTC student at Tufts, and then late in my junior year of school, early in my senior year of school was 9/11. And so the entire paradigm of the world shifted, and I was commissioned as a brand new infantry second lieutenant in 2003. So they were supportive, but I think every person who serves, but also every family that serves, really takes a journey into understanding what the nature of that service means. And so, as much as we have, many Americans who've served in these 9/11 wars, we also have many families who've also done their own type of service. And in many ways, their service is more difficult because they don't necessarily exercise the same agency that their family members, whether they be spouses or children, have overseas. And what I mean by agency is, when you're in a war zone, when you're back on the base, or when you're, out taking risks outside the wire, your family doesn't necessarily know the difference. And they're just sort of waiting at home with a certain latent anxiety about your well-being. So every family takes that journey, and mine certainly did as well, but they're always very supportive of me.
So, Admiral, can a rogue Navy commander who commands a nuclear-armed submarine launch one without orders from the President of the United States? Is that possible?
It is not. That's a simple question. Absolutely not. And that's, believe me, the way we want it. The question is, do we want the president, even though he or she is the elected official of all of us, to have that incredible power to simply launch a nuclear strike? This is a conversation we need to have at a national level. I would argue it's time to step away from that lone man or woman and create a system that has a few more checks and balances before we vote to end the world.
So, Admiral, for the last 25 seconds we have, you had what I consider one of the greatest titles in the world, Supreme Allied Commander. When you had that title, what did your wife call you? What did your children call you when you're the Supreme Allied Commander?
Oh, it's easy. They call me Supremo. And, you know, we continue that to the day in the family. No, they call me Dad, Jim. You know, it's all good. But thank you for that. And above all, thank you for having Elliot and I on today. You've done your usual incredible job moving us through 30 minutes. Thank you, David Rubenstein.
Well, thanks both of you for writing this book, and I highly recommend it. And I want to thank the National Book Festival for making this possible. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Bye.